So, hello everyone, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And it's very nice that we're having this MoonCon event. I've learned a lot already by watching the videos, and I hope everybody takes advantage because there's some real experts, elders, knowledgeable folk who are sharing, and it's just a pleasure. So I have one book with Moon Books, which is called The Legacy of Druids. Um, it's conversations with Druid leaders of Britain, the USA, and Canada, past and present. And what this was when I was studying to be a Druid, and I've been a Druid officially since 1983, but I did my first initiation, I think, in 1984. As part of my studies, I was very curious because it seemed like every Druid that I ran into, if I asked them, what is a Druid? I got a different answer from everybody. It could be anything from, I had an Irish grandmother, I like trees, that made them a Druid. Or somebody else might say, I studied Celtic scholarship and Gaelic languages, and I'm a Druid. Uh, and I just wanted to know what the founders and elders of the various traditions were thinking when they started the modern Druid movement. So what I did was I interviewed a bunch of American Druids. That was easy enough. It was just a question of going to festivals and with my little microphone and recording, interviewing people and recording and then transcribing. But then I got a little more ambitious and I went to England and I sought out various Druid founders and leaders in England because, I wanted to know what they were thinking. And along the way, I was a member of a number of different Druid groups, including OBOD, ADF. I co-founded the Henge of Keltria, and I was there for many years. I co-founded and then was co-chief at the Order of the White Oak. Now I'm Archdruid of Tribe of the Oak. And all of that modern Druid history is in this book. Excuse me, there's a lot of pollen in the air, so if I cough, that's what's going on. But anyway, what I wanted to do today, rather than talking about all the modern different Druid orders, and I should mention that Philip Cargam wrote the foreword for this one, and he was Archdruid of Obod for many, many years. They now have a female Archdruid, which I'm Amer Burke, which I'm very, very happy about. But I thought I would talk a little bit about my own perspective because, the old story, if you ask 3 Druids, what is a Druid, you're going to get 10 different answers. So the only thing I can really talk about is from my own perspective, which is Celtic Reconstructionist Druidism. And if anybody's interested, our group is called Tribe of the Oak. It's tribeoftheoak.com. So we're most interested in the old teachings. And excuse me, pollen in the air. Woo. Some Druid groups are more interested in British lore, of which there is a lot. We happen to be more focused on Irish lore. And that's because some of the oldest material that we know of does come from Irish teachings, which were oral for a long, long time, and then were written down in the 6th century and 7th century by Christian monks. So we owe them a debt of gratitude, and unfortunately, they also like to alter things. So it's hard to know sometimes what's really what. But I thought I would start by saying I do have a little rant. One of the things that I don't like hearing is when people say, we know nothing about the Druids, and then they go on to invent, whatever they want about Druids. We actually know quite a bit about Druids. The thing is, it takes time, years of study to read the books and really understand. So what the heck is a Druid anyway? So back in the day, and I'm talking about before the Christian missionaries showed up, you had all these little tribal kingdoms, and each tribal kingdom had a king or a queen, and they had the exact same cultural model as the Brahmins in India. You know, you had the Druids, who were Brahmins, then you had the warriors, then you had the farmers and producers, and then you had the slaves. In India, that would be the untouchables, the Sudra, but it was the same exact social structure. That's called the Indo-European culture. So within the tribe, you have the king and you have the druid. And the druid is Nemed, or sacred, Brahmin, member of the sacred class. They were the intellectuals and the scholars. And they said that every tribe had two kidneys. The two kidneys were the king and the druid. And they both functioned, you know, they were both powerful within the tribe. But the king was from the warrior class, because the king had spent many years learning how to decapitate heads and use weapons and all the arts of war. That's what the king was supposed to have. The king also had a ritual function, but they were expected to be a competent warrior. Think of King Arthur, right, going off to battles. Then the druid, think of Merlin. The druid is the intellectual, the scholar, the judge, the lawyer. You know, they know the laws and the precedents. They hold that in their head. The king has spent many, many years learning how to bash people over the head, and, you know, that's a different skill set. So here's the druid. Now, the druids, we know they had many different specialties. They could be healers. You know, they could be that, and by healing, that's herbalism and magical healing. They could be sacred singers, they could be storytellers, they could be lawyers, judges, ambassadors. They could be history keepers, they could be philosophers. I mean, they could be ritualists. And there were female druids, because they, like the Brahmins, people were born into a druidic family, or they went off to druid college. They might be sent to druid school by their parents or actually their grandparents, not their parents. And that's because you had to be 3 generations of wealth before you could be sent to druid college. You couldn't just, a father couldn't just send a son to druid school. A grandfather could. Anyway, that's part of it. But so the king also has a mystical function. And the king had a heavy responsibility, which was justice. And the justice of the king was everything. If the king was not just, then the land would suffer. And that means that there wouldn't be food to eat, the trees wouldn't bear fruit, children would be born deformed, there would be no fish in the rivers. It was a really big deal. So the goal was for a just king. And if you have a just king, the land is fruitful, and you have, quote, 9 nuts on every branch and 9 branches on every bough. 9, the number 9 means a lot. So the land is very fruitful. Okay, so types of druids, druid specialties. You have the priest, who advises the ruler on spiritual matters and conducts rituals. You have the brehon, who is the judge, the keeper of law, the keeper of history. They oversee contracts, they oversee oaths and fasting. Fasting is a big deal. You could fast against someone if they had wronged you, and it was very shameful if you fasted against them and they didn't give you recompense. But anyway, the brehon, or the judge, would oversee that. Then you have the phila, who is the keeper and creator of sacred stories, poetry, and philosophy. They are the invokers of the gods, and they speak with the voice of prophecy. It's a very highly trained poet. Who knows, and I'll get into that maybe if we have time. We only have 45 minutes, but There were very specific rituals, and we actually know the rituals that were used to induce prophecy. Then you have the Faith, who is the seer, and the seer interprets sacrifices to the gods. So was the sacrifice accepted? Was it not? They read omens. What does it mean when an eagle flies over? What does it mean if a wren is speaking from the southwest corner? What does it mean if you see a raven? That kind of thing. They are also astronomers and timekeepers. So they know what time of year it is based on where the stars are. You have the Leah, who is the healer, but by healing, it's both herbal medicine and magical arts together. Okay. And that's just an outline of who they were. So there are a lot of books. As I said, it drives me nuts when people say we know nothing about the Druids, but there's a great book, and these books are pretty expensive now, but this is called the Oidacht Morin, which you can get from the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. But it's by Fergus Kelly, and it's the Testament of Moran in English. But we have in that book, we have an actual ceremony. It's a king-making ritual where the Druid is giving advice to the new king and telling the king what they're going to have to do in order to be successful. Because remember, the justice of the king is tied in with the fate of the land, so it's very heavy. People will die if you're not just. And how can you be just unless you have a Druid at your side who knows the correct laws and precedents and so on? But I'll just read a little excerpt. This is the kind of thing, if you're a Celtic Reconstructionist Druid, this is the kind of thing that we like. We like the old stuff. And so it says, tell him before every other word, bring him with every word this lasting advice. Let him preserve justice, it will preserve him. Let him raise justice, it will raise him. Let him exalt mercy, it will exalt him. Let him care for his tribes, they will care for him. Let him help his tribes, they will help him. Let him soothe his tribes, they will soothe him. Tell him it is through the justice of the ruler that plagues and great lightnings are kept from the people. So one of the things that you pay attention to is if the weather is really awful or if plague descends on the land, that's the responsibility of the king, the ruler. So if you're a modern Druid and you're looking at events that are happening in the world, you might draw a little conclusion from that. Anyway, it is through the justice of the ruler that he judges great tribes and great riches. It is through the justice of the ruler that he secures peace, tranquility, joy, ease, and comfort. Anyway, it goes on. But we have the entire ritual. We have the whole thing. And again, if you're interested in Celtic Reconstructionism, you can visit us at tribeoftheoak.com. But I must warn you, we do require quite a bit of reading. Because this isn't something that you can just pick up in a minute. Okay, so another type of Druid is the bard. And a bard, nowadays when we say, oh, the bard, we think of some guy with a guitar who sings a song. Again, it was much more than that. And we have a book. It's called the Urakechna Rear, The Laws of the Poets, which again, Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, Early Irish Law series. There's 2 volumes. And what it does is it goes into the exact training, step by step, of what it took to be a bard. So bards were very powerful because they would go to different kingdoms and they would tell stories and play music for the kings. But if the king didn't treat them nicely, like if you were the highest trained type of bard, an Olav, which would be like a PhD bard in our terms, and you had an honor price, and I'm just making this up, but say your honor price was 24 cows, which is not unlikely if you were up at the top. And the king barely gave you a ham sandwich and a glass of warm ale, then you would compose a satire. And that was a very bad thing. We still do that, political satire. You find it on Facebook every day of the week. But if they would compose a song and a poem about the hospitality that they received, and the power of their satire was so intense that if it was well composed, the king would break out in hives. And once that happened, they had to step down. They couldn't be king anymore. That's how serious it was. And also, a highly trained bard could go into a house that was infested with rats and satirize the rats to death, according to the literature. That's how good they were. But anyway, in these books, The Laws of the Poets, we know step by step exactly what they were learning. So there's the Ogham alphabet, which many people know as the tree alphabet. And that's just one. There were many different alphabets. It's called Ogham. There's River Ogham, Cow Ogham, musical notation Ogham, the letters, the notes on the harp. Each note that you pluck is actually a letter of the alphabet. So you can send messages. Like if you had two Druids at a feast and they wanted to communicate across the room, one Druid or bard could be sitting there with the harp plucking out a tune, and the other bard would know exactly what they were saying. But in the first year of their training, they had to learn 50 different alphabets. They also had to learn grammar, and they also had to learn 50 different tales, 50 stories, and that's just year one. Again, year two, 50 more alphabets, 6 lessons in philosophy. They had to learn poems, and they had to learn 30 more tales. Year three, 50 more alphabets, 6 more lessons in philosophy, 40 poems. And when I say poems, we're not talking about blank verse. We're talking about very specific rhyme schemes, and they had to be able to recite them and compose in them. Year four, the laws of privileges, 20 more poems and 50 more tales. Year five, more grammar and 50 more tales. Year six, the secret language of the poets, 48 poems, 70 tales. So you can imagine a highly trained bard was kind of like, Brad Pitt or something. They were like a superstar. They had all this stuff in their head and they could recite all night. 7th year, the laws of bardism. Year 8. Now, year 8 is when we get into the magical practices of the bards, which I wanted to talk about. And I do a whole 2-hour lecture on this. So, again, we only have a few minutes, but by the 8th year of their bardic training, if you want to read about these practices, go to the Yellow Book of Lycan. And these are the techniques that they used to incubate poems and to prophesy. So it's kind of a big thing. The first one is Imvas Faroshni, or illumination between the palms, or palm knowledge of enlightenment. What the heck does that mean? Okay, imbus is poetic inspiration. It's poetic inspiration which descends suddenly. It's not something that you sit down and intellectually figure out. It's like it descends on you. The fire in the head, suddenly illuminated, Farosni means illuminated. So you have illuminated sudden wisdom, kind of. And this is a technique of sacred poetry that conveys spiritual truth. So then we have, I'm not an expert Irish speaker, so forgive me. Dichtel do Chenne, recital from the ends of the fingers, or declaration from the ends of the bones, or poem from the ends of the fingers. This is a spontaneous uttering of prophecy using the fingertips as a mnemonic device. So composing and reciting at the same time. And what's interesting is the church, when the missionaries came and converted people, the church could not outlaw these things because they did not involve calling in spirits, calling on gods and goddesses. It was literally, it was just from the head of the Druid. And these are not memorized poems. This is not poetry that you remember, using your fingers, but it's inspired poetry that descends on you. Okay. So here's one example. The poet goes into a dark room, and you can do this at home, kids. Go into a dark room, and that means, heavy curtains on all the windows or shutters shut, door closed. And the poet would go under a hide. So you can imagine if you had a leather hide over your head, there would be no light coming in. You could also wrap a tartan around your head. That would work. The poet pronounces an invocation or prayer over their hands, then places them crosswise over their face and eyes. Then they go into a trance or meditative state. Okay, so they're like this in the dark, which is actually a lot like being in the womb. That's really what it is. You're going back to the womb. You're going back to source to incubate a poem. What happens when you incubate chickens? They're in the egg, and then they come out. Well, the poet incubates the poem in that state. And then another druid shows up, and they rip off the leather covering or pull off the tartan, throw open the doorway, and then there's a light. It triggers spontaneous visions. You've been lying there in the dark, and that sudden light, because you don't know when it's going to come, and all of a sudden they start to utter prophecy, comes out. There's another one where you just lie on the ground in the dark with a big stone on your belly. That's the stone on the belly meditation. And you lie there until you incubate a poem. A stone on the belly is an awful lot like a woman who is pregnant with a baby, right? You're lying there with the baby, the weight of the baby. That's what this is. It's a very female kind of process of incubation. But you lie there with this big heavy stone on your belly. You don't eat, you don't drink, and you compose a poem. And again, it's not blank verse like we have today, which, usually doesn't work, but sometimes does, But they had very precise rhyme schemes. And you had to compose this whole poem, and it had to speak the truth, and it had to be in a specific meter. And ideally, the poem would reveal some kind of secret knowledge. There are other rituals where the poet chews on a piece of raw flesh, and that's flesh of dog, flesh of cat, flesh of pig, or flesh of bull, while meditating. And they place the chewed meat on a flagstone behind the door as an offering to the spirits. So that one kind of threw me. I thought, eating a cat flesh is not a very common thing. And I was trying to figure, for the longest time, I couldn't figure it out. So of course I meditated on the whole thing, and I had a vision of what was going on here. So what's happening is, when you eat that raw flesh, you become like a wild animal. That means you become one, or it opens up the portals between you and nature, shall we say. You become part of the wildness. And When they did that, they were no longer fully human. They were now in and out of the spirit world. That's what we call a liminal space. They're not quite human. They're not quite animal. They're not quite civilized. They're not quite in nature. They're in between. They're walking between the worlds. And when they did that, they could have an answer within hours, or they could have an answer within minutes. Now, these are kind of elaborate rituals. There are other ones where the Tarbfeisch, or the bull feast, where if they were having a big debate about who should be the next king, the kings were elected, by the way, and they could be fired if they misbehaved. Um, or if the land was suffering, they could be fired. Or if they had a blemish from satire, they could be fired, But usually they were elected from among noble families. It wasn't everybody who could be king. But suppose there were different families and they were all competing to have their little golden boy or golden girl, being the next ruler, and they were all at odds. So they would call on a seer and they would say, okay, what do you think? And then the seer went through a trance journey. Again, we have records of this. So they would sacrifice a bull and they would take off the hide. They would turn it inside out. And again, this is like a womb. The seer is placed inside of the hide. The hide is sewn up. So there you are. You're back to the womb again. And the seer stays in there until they get the answer. And so these are elaborate rituals that they did. But if you were a highly skilled poet, the highest grade of bard or fille, and you really knew what you were doing, you didn't have to go through all this stuff. You could go into trance anywhere. For example, if there was a battle going on, and we know that if the druid walked out onto the battlefield, all hostilities ceased, because the druid you didn't kill a druid. And the druids, they did do battle magic, but they didn't fight with their weapons. But each druid was like a library, a walking library. Think of all those stories, right? So the druid is a sacred person, and they walk onto the battlefield, everything stops, and instantly the druid gets a vision, and they make a prophecy. And hopefully that would stop, the contention. So if any of you have ever been to a kirtan, if you've ever had a bad experience where you kind of go into trance from singing and chanting, there's a type of trance called tenev loida. And again, forgive me if I'm saying that wrong, but that was an altered state brought on by repetitive chanting or singing, where the mind and body become synchronized in an external rhythm, and the person transcends normal perception. They go into an altered state. They achieve a state of inner peace and extreme focus. And then once you're in that state, you can commune more easily with the gods, more easily with the ancestors. Again, you can make prophecies, you can have visions. And I urge everyone, if you can, go to a real Indian Hindu style kirtan and allow yourself to go into trance, and you'll have a sense of what they were doing. So, would each tribe have more than one druid, as there were so many different subjects to learn? Did the druid choose which subjects to specialize in? Yes. Because one druid is not going to be a physician, a master physician, and also be an ambassador who's running all over the countryside, negotiating contracts. So you specialized. And there were druids who their whole specialty was history and genealogy, so that when the king had a feast, that druid would stand up and recite the genealogy going back 1,000 years, of the begats and the begats, and compose praise poems in honor of the king and all that. You can't be doing that if there's a medical emergency. It doesn't. So Druids were a class. The class is called Nemed, which means sacred, which is the equivalent of Brahmins in India. So think Brahmin. They were Brahmins. They're born into that class. The king comes from the warrior class, which I hope I'm saying this right, but in Hindu tradition, the Kshatriya, the warriors, the king has to be ritually elevated into the Nemed class. The Druid is born into the Nemed class. And they had different specialties. I hope that answers it. Okay, so one thing which I thought I would bring up, which is kind of fun. And I guess I should wave this around some more. This book, A Legacy of Druids, again, is about modern Druids. It's not about ancient Druids. Although the Druid leaders that I interview in this book do mention, ancient Druids from time to time. But I wanted to know what modern Druids were doing and what they were thinking. And that was just part of my own training. And here I am. It's it's 30 years, 40 years later, and I'm still learning. But all right, so this is a fun one. These are the marriage laws, and I do want to start by saying that yes, there were female Druids, and I have an essay that's floating around on the internet. If you just Google my name and female Druids, it'll come up. Druids were raised in Druidic families, which means they were trained by their father and their mother, just like Brahmins. But there's a great book called A Guide to Early Irish Law, which I highly recommend for starting these kind of studies, Guide to Early Irish Law, Fergus Kelly. And Fergus Kelly mentions briefly, and I will say male scholars generally ignore female Druids. You can read an entire book and it will never mention a female Druid, not even once. Okay. But he has two mentions. He says on page 55, a false judgment may even have physical side effects on the judge responsible. The cheeks of the legendary judge Sencha are said to have become blotched when he pronounced a biased judgment regarding legal entry by women. The blotches disappeared, however, when Brigg, it's a female judge, passed a true judgment on the matter. Okay. And women poets. The Annals of Innisfallen, 934 AD, record the death of Ulla, daughter of Minchin, who is described as Ban Fili Aaron, File, poet, Ban, woman poet of Ireland. It is clear, therefore, that a woman could be recognized as a fully fledged poet, though it must have been regarded as unusual. And that's his assumption, of course. And then he goes on to assume it is probable that the admission of a woman into the poetic class occurred mainly when a poet had no sons and a daughter showed some aptitude for the profession. So again, he's kind of dismissing women poets, Thankfully, what's happening now as more and more women get into Celtic studies, people are delving a little bit more deeply into the role of women. But so the fun thing that I wanted to bring up is the marriage laws, because this is the one that people usually want to hear about. But they had 9 different kinds of marriage, and they were all legal. And you had responsibilities to the spouse in all 9 different kinds of marriage. The first one is the union of joint property, into which both partners contribute movable goods. So in other words, and if you had property, that meant you were noble. So we're already talking about the nobility here, or the rulers. And that means that the female noble shows up with a certain amount of property, cows, sheep, slaves, whatever. And the husband, the male ruler, has the exact same number of cows, sheep, you know. If you want to know a little bit about this, there's a great story, The Cattle Raid of Cooley, or the Tain Bo Cooley, which talks about a king and a queen competing with each other to see which one is going to be in charge. And the one with the most property is the one who ends up in charge. That's the rule. But in the first degree of marriage, the union of equals, you're supposed to show up with the exact same amount of property. And that means that you both have equal say when there are decisions to be made. Okay. Then there's the union of a woman on man property, where the woman contributes little or nothing. So now the woman has no property, but the man has property. But the fact that he has property still says he's a noble, and she came in, she has no property, and that means he's in charge. And the union of a man on woman property, where the woman has all the cows and the land and all that, and the man has nothing. So she's in charge. And he is expected, it's not like he comes in and does nothing, you know. He's expected to take care of her herds, her land, her sheep, whatever. He has work to do there. The fourth category is called the union of a man visiting, where the man visits the woman at her home with her kin's consent. So now we're moving into an area where there's no property. And once you have no property, now it implies peasants. So we're moving into, or farmers, you know, they're no longer noble. But this is an honorable union. The family knows that he's showing up. He comes for a visit. Now, why would this happen? Maybe a farmer has a wife and she's barren. And so he might have a child with somebody else. Or, well, if a man refuses to have sex with a woman, she can actually divorce him, or if he's impotent or something. Okay, in the fifth union, and again, now this is no longer nobles. It's getting less and less status as we go down. In the fifth union, the woman goes away openly with the man, but is not given by her kin. So she says, I'm out of here, and she crawls out the bedroom window and she goes, and everybody knows that she went off with Fergus, and her family did not approve, but she went anyway. But that's a legal marriage, because when you do that, once you have sex with somebody, whoop, you're married. In the sixth union, and again, we're getting less and less honorable here. In the sixth union, she allows herself to be abducted. In the seventh, she is secretly visited, and in both cases, without her kin's consent. Something about kin. In those days, people weren't individuals so much. They were part of a derfin, which is 4 generations. And if one person screwed up, if one person did something illegal or hurt somebody or killed somebody or whatever, the entire derfin, all 4 generations of the family, are now responsible for paying reparations for whatever the misdeed was. The 8th and 9th unions can in no sense be described as marriage, as they are union by rape, and the union of 2 insane persons. That's my favorite one. The last one, imbeciles and idiots. But these are legal marriages, okay? So if a woman is raped and she becomes pregnant, the rapist is absolutely supposed to provide for the child. That's in the law. And the union of 2 insane persons, if you have an imbecile who marries an idiot, you know. In your tribe, they can be legally married, but the law says that the tribe is now legally responsible for their upkeep. So they can live together as man and wife, but the entire tribe is now, or the entire Derfin is now responsible for bringing them wood and food and making sure that they're warm and they have medical care. So the laws the tribal laws are very well thought out. And ooh, is there any particular areas of the country that has more prevalent Druidic practice? Okay, I don't know which country you're referring to. I'm in the US, I'm in Massachusetts. There are Druids everywhere. We are everywhere. In my group, Tribe of the Oak, we have people all across the US. We have people in Canada. We had people in Mexico for a while. Where else? Ireland. I don't know if we have anybody in England at the moment. I can't remember. We have people all over the place. There are Druids everywhere. There are Druids in Australia. I think we have one in Australia now. So I hope that answers the question. We are everywhere. We're just, I wish a survey was done again, like was done many years ago. Green Egg magazine did a survey, and I never forgot it because it was kind of a shock to me. But they asked people, what type of pagan are you? And it turned out that most people said they were Wiccan or pagan. Only 2% of all pagans said that they were part of a specific tradition like Druidism or Egyptian religion or Greek religion or Roman or whatever. Just 2%. So anyway, as I was saying about the laws, studying the Brehon laws is very valuable, especially if there's any lawyers listening to this. There's a modern movement called restorative justice, which we think of as this brand new idea that instead of punishing people with a jail term and a fine, you actually try to get the person together with the person that they wronged, and you work out some kind of a healing mechanism, and this is to restore the community. So you might, paint their house or do their yard work for a year, or wash their car or something like that. That's how the Druids thought of justice. It was like, how do we repair the community? How do we repair the tribe? And unfortunately, what would happen is the judges would decide that the fine should be a cow. So a family would take the cow over to the offended party and give them the cow. But then somebody in the offended party's family would say, or no, the family that paid the fines family would say, how dare they take our stinking cow? And then they would go steal the cow. And cattle raiding back and forth would happen, but it's hard to control humans. But anyway, so I see that I only have a couple of minutes left. If anybody has a question, please feel free to ask it now, because I think I have 1 or 2 minutes left. So I just want to wave this book around one more time, A Legacy of Druids. And what's happening now, this is becoming more and more valuable, this book, as time goes on. I have a lengthy interview with Olivia Robertson, Lady Olivia Robertson in here, who is the founder of the Fellowship of Isis. I have interviews with Isaac Bonowitz, Tim Sebastian. What's happening is some of these people that I interviewed are now passing to the other world, and that will be happening more and more. So if you want to get a sense of who they were and what they were thinking, I urge you to look at it, for modern Druids. Again, if you want to study with us, tribeoftheoak.com. We'd love to have you. Just be prepared for a lot of study. And I want to thank Trevor, and I want to thank everybody who put this together. Thank you, Trevor.